Appreciate that. That's very helpful. All right, I'll call the Budget Committee meeting to order in my capacity as mayor, and I'll ask if I don't see how you could possibly have a pecuniary interest. I'll let it be recorded that I asked, and I don't see any. And I will look for nominations for chair of the committee. Councillor Knoll.
Your Worship, I'd like to nominate Councillor Adams as chair of this year's Budget Committee.
Thank you, Councillor Knoll. Are there other nominations? All right. Not seeing any other nominations and asking one more time and waiting, I declare the nominations closed. And Councillor Adams, thank you for agreeing to do this hard-slugging job for another year.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So that deals with item 5.1 on the agenda. We have the other two items, 5.2 and 5.3, which is the state of infrastructure report and the budget forecast. And I think our staff have a few words to share with us on these items.
Oops. Good evening, everyone.
Great to see you back. The floor is yours.
Thanks. So just waiting for the presentation there. Okay. So for tonight's presentation, I thought we would start off with a little bit of an overview of what asset management is. It's been a while since we've come and done an update on asset management, so I thought a bit of a refresher would be good. Then we'll give an update on the town's progress in meeting the Regulation 588-17, a bit of an overview on the asset management policy and strategy that was approved last month. Then we'll get into the State of Infrastructure report and talk about next steps. So what is asset management? Strategic asset management is a decision-making process that answers the fundamental question, how do we best care for the assets to deliver services to our residents that they rely on every day in a predictable, cost-effective manner? It's about developing a long-term plan that not only maintains our existing assets, but identifies future infrastructure needs required to provide services as the town grows, build resiliency against environmental impacts so that our residents can enjoy the services and amenities that contribute to their quality of life. Asset management is not an IT system, but much more of a philosophy or a program that can help us achieve our objectives and allows the town to practice intentional rather than reactionary oversight of the services we provide. It helps us plan for the future, manage risk, maintain our assets over the whole life of their lifespan, and determine how best to invest our resources. It requires clearly defined organizational and associated asset management objectives to ensure that decisions at all levels consistently drive towards realization of value and customer satisfaction. So the main components of the asset management program are service levels, risk, costs, all which result in achieving the best value from our services. Service levels considers the current and future performance needs from our assets. Risk involves minimizing the impact of asset failure and considers the level of consequence to our services. Costs involves identifying the options and looking at the whole life cost of the asset, not just the initial capital outlay, but the ongoing maintenance, renewal, and future needs required for replacement. When all three are considered in our decision-making, it allows us to deliver safe and sustainable services. So in a nutshell, it's about evaluating the options and the cost benefit to provide valuable services while optimizing the cost to the taxpayer. In essence, residents want safe and sustainable services delivered in a predictable, cost-effective manner. The asset management system is based on determining expected levels of service of the community and using a holistic approach to ensure those services are maintained over the long run. So that at the end of the day, we avoid unnecessary disruptions or poor quality services and meet our service level objectives. So the key component of risk is about balancing the likelihood of failure and the consequence of the service being disrupted by that failure. For example, there's a difference between a service disruption of one individual trail versus a disruption of a water utility in the main facility. Condition or age may be an indication of the likelihood of failure. However, just because an asset is in poor condition or at the end of its useful life doesn't necessarily mean it requires a major intervention or a capital replacement. Using risk gives us a more objective assessment and considers the impact on the service. It identifies the critical assets with the highest likelihood and consequence to determine the most urgent needs. It links our asset management activities to service levels and draws upon institutional knowledge and experience. Alternative strategies to capital replacement can be considered if the consequence of failure is lower, such as monitoring operational effectiveness by increasing inspections or preventative maintenance. If the consequence is high, but the likelihood is low, then contingency plans can be put in place for the off chance that the service failure may occur. By having clearly defined service level objectives, we can determine the asset performance needs and the different options available. Then by assessing the whole life costs and the individual risk factors, we can determine the most appropriate budget investments required for our infrastructure. An important piece to note is the prioritization of budget needs. The Asset Management Department has developed a risk-based prioritization model that's based off of the framework in the asset management strategy. This will be applied to the infrastructure renewal program as part of the 2022 budget process. This will help to corporately prioritize the capital needs so funding is directed to the highest risk areas. This asset management cycle is an ongoing process that takes time to develop a long-term, sustainable, and affordable asset management plan and financing strategy to achieve the balance between cost and service levels. So in closing of this part, I just wanted to mention that we currently have a number of online asset management training videos that expand further on a number of the ideas and concepts that I discussed. These videos are available on YouTube, and I'm happy to forward the links to Council. In addition, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has a higher level overview video that is available that is a little bit easier for residents to understand. That is a good little 4-minute video that you can share with your residents if they're asking any questions. So asset management at the town of Oakville. So as you are aware, the town of Oakville has been on the asset management journey since 2009 and the introduction of PSAB 3150, which required us to record the value of our tangible capital assets in our financial statements. As a result, municipalities have been on a steady learning curve over the past number of years as asset management became more sophisticated, involved from just maintaining our assets to developing financing strategies that are aligned with achieving value from our assets and linking them to our service levels. In 2013, municipalities were required to have an asset management plan in order to be eligible for grant funding, such as the gas tax funding. In 2014, ISO 55000 was established, which set the standards for asset management plans and practices. In 2017, new development charge legislation was introduced, which requires municipalities to have an asset management plan that demonstrates the town's planning for operation, maintenance, and replacement of all of our growth assets. And finally, in December 2017, the new regulation 58817 was approved, setting out specific requirements and timelines for municipalities in regards to asset management planning. In response to these developments, the town has adopted the ISO 55000 standard and hired a consultant to assist in the development of the town's asset management plan and prepared its first State of Infrastructure report in 2015-16. This led to the approval of our first asset management policy by council in 2017, which was followed by the first strategy and asset management plan being presented to council in 2018, along with the development charges study and long-term forecast. And that brings us to today and where we are in meeting the regulation requirements. So the province of Ontario recognized the importance of asset management planning when the regulation 58817 was enacted. The regulation outlines guidelines and expectations for the application of asset management principles for municipalities and identifies numerous key deliverables in a phased-in approach over the 2019 to 2025 timeframe. In phase one, every municipality needed to prepare its first strategic asset management policy by July 1st, 2019. It is required to review and update this policy, if necessary, every 5 years. So recently, staff presented the revised policy and strategy, which was approved at the May 24th council meeting. In phase 2A and B, the municipality shall prepare an asset management plan in respect of all its core infrastructure by July 1st, 2022, and with respect to all the other infrastructure by July 1st, 2024. Core infrastructure is defined as water, wastewater, stormwater, roads, bridges, and culverts. The goal of these asset management plans is to ensure municipalities have a good asset inventory, condition, and life cycle activities identified, with the focus all being on existing service levels. The intent of phase 3 is to then build on those asset management plans that were developed in phase 2 and determine proposed levels of service and develop a financing strategy on how to meet those levels of service. These revisions are to be endorsed by council by July 1st, 2025. So one of the main concepts of asset management outlined in the ISO 55000 standard is to establish a clear line of sight between council's strategic objectives and the asset management practices. This starts by reviewing the organization's strategic plan and council's strategic goals, which set out the high-level vision and objectives. The asset management policy then defines the key asset management principles and the direction regarding expectation. Our asset management policy includes 6 key principles, there being forward-looking and sustainable, sound asset information, robust, repeatable, and transparent decision-making, whole life costing, risk-based, and people-focused. The asset management strategy then expands on how the policy will be delivered and builds on these principles by translating to key stakeholders the needs and aligning asset management objectives. The asset management strategy sets out a number of key frameworks for asset management governance, risk assessment, service level profiles, and capital prioritization, as well as short and long-term continuous improvement objectives. Revisions were recently made to enhance the consideration of climate change lens in our asset management practices, as required by the new regulation. The last step in creating this line of sight is preparing individual asset management plans with these objectives in mind. This sets out the what, the where, and why by setting out specific life cycle activities needed in the short and long term to manage the service expectations. So asset management plans start with knowing what we own, where it is, what it's worth, what condition it's in, what services rely on these assets, and what needs to be done and when. In order to continue delivering safe and sustainable services in a predictable manner, staff needs solid information on our assets. Without this information, we are unlikely to be able to identify possible service disruptions and other risks. So what do we own? As I noted earlier, in order to align asset management activities with the town's overall service objectives, it's important to understand what assets support the individual services provided by the town. So this graph displays the total replacement value of all our assets for the various service areas, which total $3.5 billion. As illustrated in the chart, 40% of our town infrastructure supports the transportation network with $1.4 billion. The second largest is stormwater management with $806 million. Other service areas that are notable are parks and outdoor leisure with $469 million, recreation and culture with $463 million, and Oakville Transit with $160 million. So for many assets, the estimated remaining useful life based on the age of the asset is considered a good starting point to estimate the overall well-being of an asset. However, in many cases, the percentage of useful life consumed based purely on age may not be the most suitable indicator of a current asset condition or replacement needed. Understanding the current condition of our infrastructure is an important piece of planning for asset renewal. Risk is also an important factor to consider when determining life cycle strategies for different asset categories. Many factors, particularly how the assets are managed, contribute to the life cycle planning. For example, certain assets receive little maintenance or rehabilitation through the asset life. Therefore, they require replacement at the end or close to end of life. An example of this would be storm pipes. Certain assets receive proactive maintenance and/or regular rehabilitation to maintain their intended purpose and may actually prolong the life of the asset beyond its useful life. An example of that would be the park's grounds, which are continually maintained. Other assets present less risk of service disruption and have a quick replacement time or alternative options available within a minute. Therefore, it might be satisfactory to let these assets run to end of life and replace them at the end, such as vehicles and computer equipment. Another factor to consider is performance of the asset, because poor design or incorrect use of the equipment may, on the other hand, deteriorate an asset before its useful life. So as mentioned in the report, we've adopted the Federation of Canadian Municipalities 5-point scale for assessing condition, which has been simplified into 3 categories for this report. Maintaining the right balance between stage of life, good, fair, and poor conditions indicates that funds are being apportioned strategically. Assets in good condition are generally new or have a very robust maintenance schedule. Assets in fair condition are midlife and still performing well but need monitoring or minor upgrades. And finally, assets in poor condition are the assets reaching the end of life and become the priority for the plans in the near-term replacement or renewal. So having an understanding of the timing and when our infrastructure was built and the age of our assets can assist with long-range planning from a high-level perspective, in particular to estimate the timing of future financial outlays for those long-lived assets. The chart summarizes assets by stage of life for the different asset classifications. As illustrated in the chart, over 60% of our town assets are in mid and early stages of life. It's important to note that the useful life of the different asset categories varies significantly. For example, the environmental network, our storm pipes, useful life is 70 years. However, on the other hand, the vehicles is only 7 years. As I mentioned, estimated useful life is based purely on age, can sometimes provide a misleading view of the replacement timing for assets. Therefore, when developing long-term life cycle replacement plans for an asset class, the useful life needs to be augmented with other information, such as the actual asset condition rating, the history of the asset upgrades and maintenance practices, and any expert judgment. So understanding the current condition of our infrastructure is an important piece of planning for the asset renewal. Condition assessments for vertical assets, such as our facilities, and observable linear assets, such as roads, the physical condition grades are objective and been based on visual observations. Where no physical condition data is available, an age-based rating has been applied based on the remaining useful life. As illustrated in this graph, over 90% of the town's infrastructure is in good and fair condition. As I mentioned, having a balance across the 3 condition levels is quite reasonable, with the goal being to minimize the portion in the poor condition, but recognize that this does not mean the assets are failing. It just means that they need attention in the near future and will be part of our immediate long-term forecast. Risk is also a factor, as some of the assets present less risk of service disruption and have quick replacement time or alternative options available. Therefore, it may be satisfactory to have a higher percentage in that poor category because we can replace them at a moment's notice. Creating regular and routine condition assessment schedules for all of our infrastructure has been identified as a main objective of the asset management strategy. So next steps. So as you are aware, the revised asset management policy and strategy was approved by Council on May 24th, which meets phase 1 objective of the regulation. The staff are currently reviewing the state of infrastructure report information and are using the age condition of their assets to help develop the 10-year capital forecast needs. And using the framework from the asset management strategy, a risk-based prioritization model has been created, which we will apply in the fall to the 2022 infrastructure renewal budget to help indicate where our overall capital funding priorities may be. Finally, over the next several months, the staff will work to complete the service profiles and define service level commitments and measures for all of our core assets, then determine what our current operating and capital resources for the core assets will be. The intention is to bring the asset management for core assets to Council in the spring of 2022 in order to meet that regulation due date of July 1st. So in closing, asset management is an ongoing process that takes time and effort to develop. An asset management program can take years to fully implement, and we need to continue to evaluate our practices and our plans to ensure that service levels are balanced with costs, options are evaluated using a risk-based framework, funding is directed to the highest priorities, and information on the overall state of our infrastructure is robust and used to develop optimal life cycle strategies. So at the end of the day, we continue to meet the desired outcome, which is to provide safe, sustainable service delivered in a predictable and cost-effective manner. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and Councillor Giddings has the first question.
Thank you, Chair Adams. Question, there's only one category that is low, and that is communications and technology in terms of condition data confidence. Is that the speed of change with new hardware, or is it the newer hardware that's needed for new technologies that we're making use of? Any sense on that?
It's a combination of both. It's partly just due to sheer volume of the number of computers and computer technology and communication, radios and telephones, that it makes it difficult to actually go out and assess the condition. So that's why we rated it low at this time. But it is something that we want to work towards, at least putting in a program for some of the keyer portions of our infrastructure.
Yeah, not too much of this last 70 years, like the
No.
reference
It's more of a
year.
5-year life cycle. By the time we
Yes.
assess the condition, we're replacing it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Councillor Lischina?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Catherine, for that great summary and review of asset management. As you said, some of the assets are quite expensive. So I'm wondering regarding economy of scale, if we partner with other municipalities or leverage our partnership with FCM or AMO to determine if other municipalities are on the same or similar life cycle of some of these assets. So, for example, the fire department. Do we do that at all?
There are a number of sort of municipality working groups. We are part of a Halton areas asset management, so we are in contact quite a bit and compare our strategies and our methodologies and even try to tackle problems like service levels and how we're approaching that. We also reach out quite often to some of our other municipalities that are close by, Mississauga, Guelph, and London. And in addition to that, a great resource for us is Asset Management Ontario, which myself and the asset managers are a part of. And they are continually supporting the municipalities in their journey to improve their asset management plans and have a wealth of information that we can share.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think I see Councillor Knoll there.
Yeah, quick question. I just want clarification on the evaluation of land holdings. So, for example, in stormwater management, or for that matter, in roads and in parks, do we? Because I was looking at the chart that was appended to the report, I didn't see an allocation for the value of the land in those circumstances. Do we account for that?
We account, through you, Mr. Chair, we account for the value of land in our financial statements, but in regards to asset management planning, we don't really set out plans for the renewal of our land. It's just an ownership.
So in the calculation of the overall asset value of our capital, it's facility does not include the land, that's included separately.
It would include the land that is like the facility, for example, is located on, but not sort of the land around it per se.
So in the case of like a stormwater management facility, how would that apply in that case? Because often stormwater management facilities have a lot of land that does not actually incorporate the holding basis for the stormwater management.
So those things would need to be considered when developing a growth plan and acquiring new infrastructure. We do include in our cost evaluation sort of site development for any of the assets that are going to be built on land.
Well, when we assume those stormwater management facilities, though, does the land value of those facilities end up in our books?
Sure, Phoebe has some more to add here.
Through you, Mr. Chair. According in our asset inventory, we do not take care of the land value, mainly because we use the asset inventory to go against the legislative requirement in accounting assets. In the accounting of the assets through the legislation is really to look at the replacement of the asset. So when you look at a stormwater pond, that land is already there. We only look at if we have to replace the entire stormwater pond, but the land's already there that we don't have to purchase again. So we follow the guidance of the legislative requirements in terms of how we I'll call it cost or account for certain assets. So the land value, such as stormwater ponds or a park, that we have received through development are not part of our replacement cost calculations in our asset management plan.
Great, that makes perfect sense. Thank you very much.
Very good. Mayor Burton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if staff would like to tell us if, in their estimation, we are ahead or behind or where we should be in the process.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe we are in line with many of the other municipalities in terms of meeting the regulation. Like I mentioned, the first stage is really understanding what you own, where it is, and what the value is. And we've been building on that asset registry for a number of years.
Great, thank you. I'm always relieved to know that we're not behind.
I think we're in a good place. I think that exhausts all the questions on this item. I don't see any others. Then I need a motion to receive this report. Councillor Knowles moved it. All those in favor? That carries. Thank you very much. Okay, so that deals with item 5.2. That's the State of Infrastructure Report. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the Q&A and the presentation. We have the 2022 budget forecast, and I think I see members of our staff there, one of whom I think is going to come forward to speak to us about this. There. Welcome.
All right, good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us here to kick off the 2022 budget process. My name is John Vanderheiden, and I'm the town's finance director, and I'm joined by Nancy Selly, our town treasurer and commissioner of corporate services, and Albar Stansovici, who's our manager of financial planning. And make sure these slides work here. There we go. All right. So just by way of background, there's a council guideline that we keep the overall property tax increase in line with inflation. That was the guideline for last year, for this year, and for next year. And I'll come back to the overall comment in a second, but just to touch on the inflation part first. The inflation target is at 2%, and that's based on an average annual inflation forecast from bank economists. When it comes to the overall tax increase, as you know, the town is a lower tier municipality, and we make up about 41% of the overall tax bill, along with the province for the education portion, and along with the region for their share. As we've built our assumptions into the budget, we've assumed that the province will be at 0% for their increase, and the region will be at 2.3% for their share, which brings us to about a 2.75% increase for us to keep the overall impact to 2%, keeping in line with council's guideline. It's also important to know that that 2% is after our assessment growth, so that does not eat into our 2.75%. And if you think of this slide as what our goal slide is, this is where we want to be in December when the budget is approved, having an overall 2% increase. There we go. All right, looking ahead to some timelines. So the budget kicks off now. We've actually also had our commission meetings with our departments over the last few days. And then we also have, then our departments take the information back from those kickoff meetings, and they work on preparing their budgets through the months of June, July, and August. Then in August and September, finance takes that information back to review it. And later on in September, they bring it to EMT for review in order to get EMT's final sign off in October. After EMT signs off, then it comes to the budget committee for their review in November and in December, before council approves the final budget later in December. Some key budget dates for the committee. So November 16th is when we actually release the budget book, and including in there is the 10-year capital forecast. On November 18th, we have our commissioner presentations where they present their program budgets. On November 30th and December 2nd, we have public delegations, one of those during the day and one in the evening. And then committee gets to deliberate on December 14th. And final approval is on December 20th. I'll swap it out, sure.
I think the batteries are dead on this one. Sorry.
That's okay. Thanks. There we go. All right, so that brings us to the preliminary budget that was included in your in the staff report. So the base budget that has been included there has a number of items to touch on. So the first is that salaries and benefits have been included based on negotiated contracts that have already taken place. It also includes some preliminary operating impacts of capital, and those do need to be refined through the budget process to make sure the amounts and the timing is correct. The third bullet there refers to our user fees, or our rates and fees. And as you know, user fees are a very important part of our revenue. And these include everything from our transit fare revenue to our parks permits, building permits, swimming lessons, parking fees, the list goes on. We are recommending that these be increased by inflation to cover normal inflationary impacts of costs and not further add to the tax levy. It's also important to do this so that we can maintain our cost recovery ratios and avoid any need for future spikes as we try to catch up. The recommended inflationary increase represents approximately $1.1 million to the tax levy. And more specifically, as part of this $1.1 million, the increase for rec and culture and parks fees are about $300,000, as they represent approximately $15 million of our overall total rates and fees. The fourth point on this slide refers to our capital levy. And as background, each year we take 1% of our prior year total tax levy and add that to our capital envelope. Last year we did not do this, as this was one of our COVID mitigation measures. Our plan for this year is to put that capital levy back in. And at this time, we've also planned to restore almost $2.1 million that we did not include from last year. We're not bringing a recommendation on that at this point. However, by restoring it back, we maintain the level of capital funding that we would have had in order for us to better fund capital project requests that come forward. Removing it means that our annual capital envelope will be short by this amount going forward. It's important to note that this could be a possible mitigation measure for us as well. We also have a note at the bottom here that the preliminary items have no new services included. Speaking more specifically about COVID, all of the 2021 COVID impacts have been reversed, basically to restore the budget to what it was before. And we'll be adding in our budgeting program a column to capture the impacts of COVID for 2022. The $10 million that you saw in the report and that you see on the slide here is primarily based on lost revenues, and that is before any mitigation measures. It's obviously our job to take that information back and continue to look for ways to mitigate the impacts of COVID. We also have on this slide as the fourth bullet that tax stabilization funding has not been included at this time, but that is also a lever that we can use and did use last year. As we go through the budget process each year, we're always looking for efficiencies that we can find in the departments and programs, and we will continue that practice this year. So that brings us to this slide here, which is where we are right now. As you can see that in order to achieve Council's direction of a 2% overall increase, we need to find reductions of approximately $6.4 million, which for our share represents just under 3%. So this is the work that we as finance and as staff need to do over the coming months to ensure that we can mitigate any impacts and we can come in at Council's direction. I want to touch briefly on the capital budget. We will be doing the 10-year capital forecast, as Catherine mentioned. The key focuses there are on the budgets, as well as the timing of the projects and what the operating impacts are. We will also review capital requests that come through the departments and work with them to ensure that they're in line with council priorities and strategic initiatives. We will also put any infrastructure renewal requests through the asset management framework that Catherine was talking about earlier. Our growth requests will continue to be based on our existing DC study. So in summary, we have lots of work to do over the next couple of months. We have to look at the impacts of COVID and further refine those and find ways to mitigate any potential budget shortfalls. The overall goal is to come in at that 2% when we pass that budget in December. And our final slide here is on the recommendations that are in our report for today. The first being that this report be received, and the second is that rates and fees be increased for next year by inflation of 2%. And we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there questions? I see Councillor Giddings is first up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The 6.4 million savings that have to be found. How will that be affected with COVID? There's an optimism now that is shared with a number of groups, and myself included. But what would the downside risk there? Obviously, we've got program costs, we've got staffing, we've got transit revenue. What other drivers would be involved with that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So in our report, I believe it's on page 3 of the report, we do talk about some of the assumptions that we've put into those revenues, because that $10 million is primarily based off of lost revenues. So as we get closer, we can further refine what our normal participation levels would be for a lot of our revenue sources. So that's one, I kind of want to say, lever that we may have. It's one of our risk factors. Goes the other way as well. If they're lower, that poses a bit more of a problem. Another area we have is that depending on which programs we offer, we do have less costs if we're not running programs. So the numbers that you had before, you're part of that 10 million or part of that 6.4 million, is just the revenue number. We haven't gone through the work of refining what the savings may be by not offering something if there is a COVID impact.
And so time is on our side as we work through the process, and hopefully with COVID decreasing as we go, it'll allow you to zero in the closer we get to the fall. Correct, and you use the phrase zero in. I would love it if a COVID column in our budget workbook would end up being zero, and that we're back to where we were before. That would be wonderful. Wouldn't we all? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hey, Councillor Lischina. Councillor, you'll need to unmute, please. At least once every meeting we have to say that.
At least once. There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jonathan, for the review. I'm trying to recall, we were looking at, when it comes to fees, adults would be the full recovery, and then the children, youth was, I think, up to 50%, but we were going to have that over 5 to 7 years. I can't recall which one that is. Do you know where we are in that cycle?
I don't recall off the top of my head. Nancy's here. She has a better history than I do.
Through you, Mr. Chair, on the groups like children and that, we were aiming for the cost recovery. On the sports fields, I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to. Over the 7 years, we were trying to get to the cost recovery. So just using inflation, obviously that will prolong that catch up to get to full cost recovery or to the targeted cost recovery for sports fields.
Okay, do we have any others? Then I think now is the time to move the recommendation in the report. Mayor Burton has moved it. Are there any dissenters? Then all those in favor? I see all the hands. Thank you very much. Then that's passed. Okay, very good. That deals with all the items on our formal agenda here. Is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up regarding the budget before we move on? Don't see anybody. Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to continue working on the budget as you saw in the presentation. If anybody has questions that they want responded to or issues that they want dealt with, please let me know so that we can work with staff to make sure that they get responded to accordingly. So look forward to seeing everybody at council in a few minutes. And so we are adjourned as the budget committee. Thanks, everybody.